Hey everyone, my name's Karel, and today we're going to be doing another From the Depths tutorial, this time on the basics of land movement. So first off, let's take a look at the components that enable land movement. Oddly enough, all of these are under the Air tab. There is no Land tab. There's Water and Air. And all the land stuff is in Air on this right side of the screen over here. So yeah, the Water tab is all water. The Air tab is mostly air, and then there's this kind of weird thing over here for land that's stuck in the Air tab. Alright, so let's start taking a look at our components here. First off, we have the Mach wheel, and each of these is going to have both a normal component and a mirrored component. Which of these you're going to use is going to depend on the side of the vehicle that you're placing it on. The orientation of them is such that you can't just turn a normal wheel around and expect it to work in the same way, at least not with the default settings. So they have mirrored versions of each of these, and they basically are just the same component, copied and, well, mirrored from side to side. So the first thing we're going to take a look at here is a Mach wheel. Now the Mach wheel is a wheel that doesn't exist. I mean, it's there, but it's not doing anything. There are no settings on this wheel. It doesn't move. You can't really do anything with it. This is literally just here for decoration. All there is to it. Next up is powered wheels. So powered wheels are a component here that lets us exert power or control authority in the forwards back direction, or forwards back relative to the wheel. If you put these sideways, they're going to let you translate side to side, but you probably aren't going to want to do that in the vast majority of cases. In any case, the wheels are just there to let you drive forwards. These do not let you turn directly. You can easily use tank-style steering with these. That is, you can drive one side forward and one side backwards, and have that differential steering that we've talked about before. Depending on how far away they are from the center of mass, that can be more or less effective. The powered wheels, however, are primarily used for forward and reverse thrust. Now you can see here they have a top speed of infinity. That means they can go infinitely fast, but they only exert 150 max force, and they only consume 5 power apiece. That's not a lot of power, and that's not a lot of force, compared to our jet engines, which exert, even in the small version, 500 force forwards. So the wheels are definitely not very powerful, and you are limited to 20 of them. That's another limitation of the Unity engine that From the Depths is built on, actually. You cannot have too many wheels interacting with the terrain on the same vehicle. So these are limited to 20. In fact, I believe all functional wheels are limited to 20 on the vehicle. You can have as many Mach wheels as you want, but the only ones that are actually going to be contributing to your power and turning are these two, and they are limited to a total count of 20 on the vehicle. Very important to remember. Alright, so taking a look at the user interface for wheels, this is slightly more interesting. In fact, I'm going to move down to one of these ones down here. These are slightly more interesting than the typical thruster components we've looked at so far. For one thing, our presets and filters have a drive wheel preset and a tank wheel preset. In any case, the presets here are a little bit different than you're used to seeing. And if we take a look over here in the detailed wheel configuration menu, this is considerably different than you're used to seeing. So this detailed wheel configuration here lets you set up all sorts of parameters about the wheels. Now, for the most part, you're going to want to set these the way you want, and then you're going to want to use the Copy to All Wheels button just to force those settings to go to all of the wheels on the entire vehicle. There's really not too many use cases for having wheels set differently on different parts of the vehicle, unless you're talking about maybe a front wheel that you want a little looser of a spring force on, so it doesn't have a tendency to bounce you up into the air when you start running up a hill or something along those lines. So yeah, for the most part, you're going to want to set these and forget them. Well, what are these settings? So the damper bump force up here, as best I can understand it, is what happens when the vehicle sustains or runs over some sort of a bump. What happens when there's a rapid change in the travel of the wheel? Every wheel has a certain amount of travel defined by the spring length here, If this is at 0, your wheel will not travel. It will not have any spring associated with it. And as you move this out, you get more and more distance up until the point where, as you can see here in the background, this is looking pretty goofy back here, this wheel that I'm editing. So I tend to leave that around 1 meter. And the damper bump force is basically how much we damp the force that gets pushed back into the wheel from the terrain. So if I travel over a bump, this damper bump force is going to dampen the amount of force going into the spring from the terrain. The damper rebound force, by contrast, is how hard, or rather how fast we push down against that. So usually these, if I grab a hold of this and place down a new wheel, usually you can see these are at 3 and 3. That's fairly sane, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that default setting for the most part. When dealing with wheels, for the most part the default settings are okay. The one thing that I do like to play with is the max spring force. Now the max spring force is going to give you springiness, or the amount of force that the wheel can apply pushing downwards once it has been bumped upwards by the terrain and the weight of the vehicle pressing down on it. So if you think about a spring, if you compress that spring by putting a bunch of weight on it, like if you have a vehicle sitting on top of a wheel that's got a spring between the wheel and the rest of the vehicle, you are compressing that spring. Now the max spring force is how strong you're going to make that spring. So if I set this really high, the vehicle's going to barely travel downwards when the weight of the vehicle is resting on the wheel, and it's going to, for the most part, respond very quickly to changes in terrain that would push the wheel up, and it's going to push right back down. So fairly high max spring force, don't necessarily just cap that automatically, but play around with it, see what you like. These are all trial and error. For most vehicles, there is no right or wrong answer except the answer that makes your vehicle work. So I'm not even going to pretend to give you specific numbers that are going to work for you. You're just going to have to experiment with these based on what you know about them and find your own way. Alright, so it looks like, to me, the max spring force interacts with the spring length. That's kind of important because it means that the spring length, if you increase this, you can see the back of the vehicle lifting up very slightly, whereas as I decrease this over the length of the spring, the vehicle is slowly lowering. So it looks to me like the spring length is actually giving me some degree of upwards force all the way over the travel of the spring. Now what that means is the max spring force is not necessarily multiplicative with, but at least has some influence on the spring length, to where having a high spring length and a max spring force that is also high will provide more total force than, say, a 1 meter spring length with a high max spring force, and vice versa. Alright, so the next settings are forward friction and side friction. Forward friction is the amount of friction you are going to give in the forwards-backwards direction of the wheel. So if I'm looking at this wheel like so, it's the amount of friction that I'm going to get in the forwards and backwards direction. And that's critically important for most wheels. If you do not have forwards friction against the ground, you do not have any way of exerting forwards thrust. So if you turn this down, you're effectively just turning this into a mock wheel. It's not going to do anything anymore. Whereas if you set this all the way up to 1, you have full friction against the ground. If you move the wheel, or spin the wheel against the ground, you're going to travel forward, and if you're on a hill and the vehicle is rolling backwards, correspondingly it's going to rotate the wheel, as you can see very slightly happening in the background here. Another setting here is side friction. This is the side-to-side friction of the wheel, and setting this too high or too low can have pretty negative consequences. If it's too high, what you get is any force sideways on the vehicle has a tendency to roll the vehicle, because you're applying effectively a force, i.e. friction, on the bottom of the vehicle, which is going to be below the center of mass most likely. So if you get some horizontal velocity going and you have the side friction set all the way up, then you run into a scenario where a sudden explosion or anything that forces the vehicle sideways, like a harpoon or anything like that, can tip the vehicle over. not necessarily what you want. Likewise, if you have it too low, the vehicle will just slide down any hill sideways. Like, you will not have any sideways control whatsoever. If this is 0 on all wheels, and I set that like so, you can see this vehicle is now just drifting sideways like it's on ice. And while interesting, that's not necessarily what you want. So yeah, be careful with that one. I would recommend having that at least at 0.5, probably more for most vehicles. Alright, now for something everyone's probably interested in, track configuration. Tracks are basically just a series of wheels that are tied together and associated with each other. And what this is going to do is produce a kind of band around the wheels in the pretty much downwards direction of each wheel. And it will basically just draw a line around the wheels and try and produce a tank tread looking thing around the entire wheel set. So if I just hit the automatic add all tracks button, it actually does a fine job. Right here you can see I've got pretty much what I intended for tank tracks on this vehicle, just kind of right there. It just did it. So that's nice. And you can see they're kind of conforming with the ground as I go over this very slight slope. Really, it does a pretty good job, just automatically right off the bat. Now if you want to set these up manually, you can do so. If I remove all the tracks here, you can see the currently selected wheels. You can see the button, or the if I hover over these wheels, it's giving me a selection window. So if I do a create new track here, and I just go ahead and let's see, I can drag this window over here and shrink it down a little bit so we can see everything. And what I'm going to do is just use middle mouse button there, rotate everything, and select. And I'm just going to add the selected wheel to the track. And I'm going to select another wheel, add selected wheel, and I'm just going to continue and iterate through this and pick the wheels that I want. So if I'm doing some sort of a half track thing where I've got tracks in the back and wheels up in the front for steering or something like that, I can do that here. So another thing about steering, tank tracks typically are just going to, oh, that's silly, that's just, yeah. Tank tracks typically are going to use differential steering. You're not going to use a typical turning wheel with a tank track. That just doesn't usually work out real well. So what you do with that for the most part is have a forward back on the left side of the tank and on the right side of the tank, and then you would use yaw rotational movement on both sides. Let's see, in this case, if I want to yaw right, yaw nose right, this tank track on the left needs to be all ahead forwards, and vice versa on the left. So in order to do that again, we would just take a look at the drive wheels. The wheels up top here with a tank tread or tank track configuration are going to be inverted from what you would expect. So as you can see here, these are red. Red means bad. This is incorrect. If I set these up correctly, in fact, I can just click the tank wheel preset here and get the exact preset I want on all of these, it looks like. The tank preset is setting yaw right and back control, whereas the drive wheel preset only sets the forward back. So if I use the drive wheel preset, it does forward. If I use tank wheel preset, it does forward and yaw right. So definitely use the tank wheel presets if you're planning on using tracks. Otherwise, the drive wheel preset does a fine job. Another thing of note here, these preset buttons, this is something that I haven't been dealing with in other tutorials yet, but if you note on the tooltip, right-click lets you add presets to each other. So if I have a drive wheel preset and I just want to add the tank steering to it, I can just right-click on that and get the yaw right out of that. If I left-click on it, in this case the wheels and the tank wheels are similar enough to each other that this isn't terribly useful. It's more useful in the other movement tutorial areas. Now the wheel configuration settings apply to both wheels and to tank tracks. Very important, the tank track is mostly visual, the wheels are still what's controlling the movement. You need to be very careful about that and be absolutely sure you pay attention to it. Alright, so the wheels here are doing their tank track thing. We've got 5 up top, 5 on the bottom, so we've got exactly 20 wheels on this vehicle that are operating. Only 10 of them are interacting with the ground, but I would not rely on that too much. I don't know how the Unity engine's limitation works for for drive wheels. I don't know if these drive wheels up here are going to be considered as actual wheels because they're providing power to the tank track or not. So yeah, I don't know if those are going to be considered as wheels on the vehicle or not. Anyway, moving on. The last component to cover, well, last two really, there are turning wheels, and then there's the sticky foot. The turning wheel, just to go over this quickly, is what looks like a normal wheel, but when you give it a yaw control, it's going to try and turn left or right like a car tire. So helps if I put that on the right side of the vehicle, or in this case the left side of the vehicle. If I was to give us a yaw left command, you can see that turning left. If I give us a yaw right command, you can see it turning right. That's really all there is to those wheels. The more of them you have, the more rotational control authority you have, and that's really all there is to it. One trick with those is you often want one at the front and the back of the vehicle, and that is because unlike jet engines, very often the front wheel or the back wheel of the vehicle will not be in contact with the ground when you're going over slopes or hills. And what that means is if you have a turning wheel at the front, then you go up a slope and the front wheel comes off the ground and suddenly you have no turning anymore. So you want to make sure that the turn wheels, that you probably have one of those at the back at least. Usually you'll want one at the front and at the back. Alright, so the last component here is the sticky foot. And this is a very complex component, really, when you get down to it. There's a lot of things going on here. I'm just going to show you what it's for, because the actual vehicle setups that make use of the sticky foot are quite complex, and I'm going to leave it up to your own creativity to experiment with this for now. I've got an experiment in the works that's kind of a two-legged walker project, but the breadboarding on that is turning out to be very exciting, shall we say. It's going to be a lot of fun getting that to work. Anyway, so the sticky foot is pretty much what you would think of a mech foot as being. It's a foot that on the bottom sticks to the ground. That's really all there is to it. There are a few different settings on this one though. The clearance is how much distance it can have between it and the ground before it starts to stick. So if I have this at, say, 5, it will look 5 meters below it for the ground when it's determining whether it's stuck to the ground or not. The stickiness, by contrast, is how much it's going to stick to the ground, how much force it's going to exert when sticking to the ground. If you have too much of this, it's going to look like you're trying to walk through glue. It's just your foot's going to stick to the ground, and you're barely going to be able to pull that up no matter how much force you exert on it. Likewise, if it's too low, then you basically don't get any force out of the foot. It's not really sticking to the ground, it's just sliding along it. So onto the forward friction and backwards friction sections. These look familiar from somewhere. And what these are is basically a indicator or a drive system that lets you determine how much friction you're going to apply in any direction. That's interesting because it lets us very precisely and very intricately control when and how much force we're going to be able to apply by means of pushing off against this foot. If you think about how you walk, your feet have friction with the ground, and that's what lets you move or take a step. If you think about walking on ice, it's very difficult if you're walking on a perfectly smooth sheet of ice to take a step forward, because as you take the weight off of one foot and put it onto the other, and then try and take a step forward, that whole Newton's laws thing comes back to bite you, and you're exerting a force backwards on that foot, which then proceeds to go backwards as you're trying to push your body forwards. So if you don't have any friction here, then you actually, or if you have negative friction, and you're trying to take a step forwards with the foot that's on the ground having no or negative friction, that foot is going to slide along the ground and you're not actually going to get any propulsion. So you need to be pretty careful about using this, and there's some very interesting tricks you can pull using breadboards and ACBs and all sorts of things to get this to work. But for now, just know that you can set the friction up if you want to, and use a spin block with a foot on it to propel yourself along the ground. Like if you have, say, 4 spin blocks along the side of the vehicle with feet on the ends of them, or on the end of a stick, and you just set the friction, forwards friction to 1, and you spin those at full rate of speed, you're going to get forwards movement out of it. And that's pretty much how it works. Worth noting that wheels do not move you very fast anymore, so the ways to move fast these days usually involve either sticky feet or mounting a jet on your vehicle, or some sort of propeller system. Anything works, really, as long as you're getting more force than the wheels can apply, because the wheels really put out a pretty abysmal amount of force. Alright, so we've looked at forward friction. Backwards friction is more of the same. It's the exact same thing. Really all that backwards friction is doing is saying, yes, if I'm pushing forwards with this foot against the ground, that is, if I'm trying to push the body of the vehicle backwards by placing pressure against this foot, is it going to slide along the ground with 0 or negative friction, or is it going to stick to the ground and push off against it with positive friction? So that's how these two tabs work. Really, the implementation details on these are very complex and not something I'm going to get into in this tutorial for sake of time. I will come back to this. I am going to take a further look at how to use sticky feet, and I am going to build a walker and show you how it's done. But that's going to be the subject of an entirely separate video, probably in more of a research and exploratory format and less of a tutorial. Alright, so when we're talking about land movement, there's a bunch of things we have to consider. I'm going to go ahead and select a smaller block here just to get the line of sight better. You'll note that I have a gap under this vehicle, and that I have wheels attached to the very bottom block on either side. That's actually fairly important for this vehicle because it helps me avoid getting high-centered. From the depths terrain is very rough in most scenarios. There are mountains all over the place. If I start traveling forwards here, eventually you'll probably run into some, and it's just a huge pain because these, the mountains that you can see off in the distance are very, very difficult to deal with. I'm going to go ahead and stop us here because it looks like my turning is off. Oh, I see what's going on here. Remember how I had set that slide force to 0 earlier, or that side friction to 0? Let's back that out. Yeah. Moving on. The basic problem with traveling over a mountain is that we have a very large hill that can have a point on the top of it. And if that point is narrower than this vehicle, the vehicle can essentially get high-centered. So consider if I had a flat bottom on this thing and no spring force or spring length here. Those wheels are going to be running right along the ground. They're barely going to be lifting this thing off the ground at all. And I don't want to rub against the ground because that A, doesn't let me apply forwards force via the powered wheels, and B, provides a lot of friction against the ground, which is just going to make me come to a stop. If you combine those two things, not being able to apply force and coming to a stop in just the wrong way, you have a vehicle that's high-centered and is basically just dead in the water, or on the land as the case may be. It's not going to be able to move ever again. It's stuck, and that's not good. So you want to avoid that at all costs. The easiest ways to do that are to use something like a U shape like this, and it doesn't have to be this exact shape or this exact size. Really, this is mainly just designed to show you how that in general is done. It's, yeah, more of a demonstration than anything. You can avoid getting high-centered by adding more spring travel distance. That does help with it because you're riding higher off the ground, and you can avoid it by just generally making the underside of your vehicle higher off the ground, which means that there is much more room under here, so you are less likely to get something coming up underneath your vehicle and making you get stuck on it. The other thing that you need to avoid is getting wedged into something. Now, that's a much more difficult task. If you notice here that I've got these wheels on the very back of the vehicle and the very front of the vehicle, like on the very front block and on the very back block, those help me avoid getting wedged into something. If I run into a cliff, it's just a sheer cliff coming straight up from the ground. These wheels on the front will still be able to apply forwards momentum because they poke out very slightly beyond the front of the vehicle. And that's just due to the size of the wheel. It will be able to exert a little bit of force from the front, and it will push downwards and forwards. So that will help me start tilting the vehicle up and getting it to more or less follow the terrain much better. Now, since these wheels don't apply a lot of force, I'm going to need some external assistance if I start trying to climb a cliff, even with this tiny little vehicle. But yeah, you can generally get away with some pretty crazy stuff using just wheels if you want to. So the reason I've placed this wheel this far forwards and also up a little bit is to help prevent that wedging scenario. Now, if I'm not on a cliff, this front wheel might not even be on the ground. As you can see there, it rides off of the ground in most cases until I come across a little rise like this, at which point it is in contact with the ground and doing work. And if I want to make it do work at all times, on this specific wheel, what I can do is increase the spring length. Since this is 1 meter higher than the others, I can change that to a 2. And come over here and change this one also to a 2. And now if I start traveling forwards, and I get to a spot where that would normally not be on the ground, you can see that this is in fact on the ground now. And it only comes off the ground when the entire front of the vehicle comes off the ground. So that's a way of giving yourself a little bit more padding on the front. You can mount the wheel a little bit higher and use the spring travel distance just to gain yourself that extra little tiny bit of momentum there. Or rather, of distance that the wheel can travel. That's a way of preventing yourself from losing momentum when you end up running into a steep hill. Alright, so we've taken a look at the wheels, we've taken a look at the steering, we've taken a look at the tank treads, and we've taken a preliminary look at the sticky feet. That is pretty much all there is to foot movement, or rather land movement, and really the handling the terrain itself is mostly just going to be a matter of placing wheels frequently, placing them in the right locations, making sure that the underside of your vehicle won't get hung up, and making sure that the front and the back of your vehicle won't get hung up on terrain. That's really all there is to it. As far as advantages and disadvantages, well, you can see from the movement of this vehicle that the disadvantage of this is that you have to deal with terrain. Terrain in From the Depths, like I've said, is very steep in places. It's not even present in a lot of the base campaign. So building a tank, a dedicated tank, is probably not your most cost-efficient move. It's only going to be able to operate in certain theaters, and when you start looking at the map in From the Depths, if I zoom out here and start looking at, say, well, for one thing, all of this water, there's so much water here. There's so much water, and it's just not really going to do you much good when you try and build a tank and 9/10 of the entire map is water. You just can't really do anything with it. Plus, if you add to that, a lot of these tiny little islands here, if you look at those are mountains. They're steep. They're steep as all get out. And you're not really going to be able to drive a tank over those. If I come up here and look at some of these areas, this looks like lava, but it actually won't hurt a tank. It's just that the terrain here is steep enough and rough enough in a lot of cases, especially over here. This Normand area, this is just a nightmare. The terrain over here is so rough, you're never going to be able to drive over it effectively. So tanks have to deal with terrain, and depending on what campaign or situation you're playing, that is a huge issue. However, and this is a big however, tanks can have basically infinite weight, especially if you start using jet propulsion or propeller propulsion to give a little bit of extra speed. Now, if you add too much weight to your vehicle, the tiny amount of force that wheels apply is not going to be able to propel you very quickly, but if you get going very quickly using jets or using propellers or ion engines or anything like that, really, if you get going with those, you really don't have to worry about the low speed or the weight of the vehicle. Because if you remember, the jets are going to accelerate you. The only thing holding back the jets is drag, and you're really not going to have weight as a counter to that. It's just going to take longer to build up inertia. So when you get right down to it, you're not really slowing yourself down by adding weight. If you're using jet or propeller propulsion, you're just making yourself accelerate slower. That means you can't go up as steep at cliffs or hills, but yeah. Anyway, the point of all of this is tanks really don't have to worry much about weight. So if I make this entire thing out of heavy armor, that's fine. It will work just fine, especially if I have some sort of air propulsion helping me out. That's a very distinct advantage of the tank and land vehicles in general. You can armor these things just out the wazoo. You can put layer after layer of heavy armor, of stacked metal and alloy and stone and wood, and just go crazy with the armor. All you really have to do is make sure that the armor isn't going to impact your ability to drive. So your armor can not be heavy enough to overcome the spring force exerted by the drive wheels across their travel length, and as long as you pay attention to that, you're fine. Just do whatever you want to. You really don't have to worry about much of anything in terms of weight. So that's really it for tanks. That's really their only advantage, to my knowledge. There's a lot of interest in the From the Depths community in tanks, and there's people out there that are a lot more experienced than I am with them. There's a number of tank-based tournaments that are run on a regular basis, and they're a load of fun. I would highly recommend that anyone looking to learn more about building tanks, go look up some of those other From the Depths tank tournaments on YouTube. There's some awesome ones out there, and I might drop a link to a couple of them in the video description. So that's really it for now, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.